Welcome back to my channel, the best place for ambitious millennial professionals who feel stuck in their careers to find their dream careers. In my last video, I explained what the immigrant glass ceiling is and what are its effects, such as earning only 75% of the majority population's dollar. So make sure you go back and watch it in case you have no idea what I'm talking about. Immigrants are missing out on a lot after they move to a new country. In this video, I'm going to share with you how immigrants and ethnic minorities can break the immigrant glass ceiling. Be sure to stay until the very end to learn the most important key to it all. Also, if you're new to my channel, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to receive regular updates on all things that will bring positive change to your career. Hi, I'm Dr. John Tam, and I'm passionate about helping millennial professionals build their dream careers. So without further ado, here's how you can smash the immigrant glass ceiling in the West. Point number one, it's to build social capital. Oftentimes when you move to a new country, you will lack the social capital, which is essentially the network to reach the best opportunities available. Did you know that only 25% of the jobs are ever posted online? In fact, most of the jobs available are in what we call the hidden job market. And so when you are lacking in social capital, you will not see these opportunities. There are two labor markets, the primary labor market and the secondary labor market. Primary labor market jobs are those that are considered stable, that are considered mainstream jobs, and there are steady advancement opportunities. On the other hand, secondary labor market jobs are considered less secure. They're contract based. They are lower paying, and they just have a higher turnover rate, and it's just not as good in terms of your work stability. And so when an immigrant comes to a new country, one of the main things they struggle with is knowing people outside of their ethnic enclaves. And so when sociologists look at immigrant settlement patterns, the main pattern that we see is that they settle in ethnic enclaves. Immigrants would typically like to move to neighborhoods where there are other co-ethnics around. So for example, if you're Chinese, you would probably like to move to an area where there are other Chinese people, since that would mean more Chinese food, there would be Chinese supermarkets, there would also be a comfort level in terms of the language that you can speak. However, a lot of times because of that, there is difficulty in bridging into the primary labor market. And so when immigrants move to an ethnic enclave, the first point of contact tends to be community centers such as religious sites, and these would be mosques, temples, or churches. And they would settle in pockets in the big cities. Very rarely would you hear about an immigrant moving to the countryside. And so when they settle in the pockets in the big cities, what happens is that it's difficult to tell whether these enclaves are good or bad. So typically there are two outcomes. The first outcome is ending up in an ethnic enclave that primarily promotes secondary labor market options. So this would be like moving to New York City and then moving to Chinatown, and the jobs available in Chinatown would be hosted by older immigrants, and they will give these jobs to newer immigrants because they don't know any better. And as a result of working with that boss who you trust because they're a co-ethnic, you actually would give up the opportunity to move to the primary labor market, and you'll get stuck working Chinatown jobs, right? So this would be an example of secondary labor market. And it doesn't have to be Chinatown. I'm using Chinese examples because I'm Chinese myself, right? So in Toronto, there's Pacific Mall, right? The one that Russell Peters talked about many years ago. Pacific Mall would be another example of a secondary labor market for people to work in the shops there. And so what happens is older immigrants may take advantage of newer immigrants, and essentially they can get roped into doing cheap labor in the secondary labor market. Some immigrants really resent these opportunities because it's underpaid and it lacks advancement opportunities since they're outside the primary labor market. And so these are opportunities that new immigrants may fall for that may not necessarily serve in their best interests. A lot of times they start working in the primary labor market and then decide that, hey, I've had enough of it, I'd rather be my own boss, and then they create their own small businesses, and as a result hire other co-ethnics because of the higher trust. So it's almost like a cycle, right? Where that's why you see these immigrant communities and immigrant bubbles pop up where there are small businesses in different languages, and everyone in them typically speak that language. Now, besides these secondary labor market enclaves, there are actually bridges for immigrants to enter the primary labor market. And there are professional class enclaves that give these opportunities for immigrants to advance. So when I was growing up in Ottawa, Nortel was still a thing. It's one of the biggest growing high-tech companies in North America at that time. And a lot of students who studied at the University of Ottawa or Carleton University actually transitioned smoothly into Nortel because of the ethnic networks that were there at that time. Of course, when Nortel stock went bust, everything blew up, right? But at that time, it was a situation where there were a lot of co-ethnics helping other fellow immigrants enter the mainstream workforce. So ethnic networks aren't necessarily bad. It depends on the network. And this reflects largely what sociologist Alejandro Portes calls segmented assimilation. Different immigrant groups assimilate to different segments of the society, and this also applies to the labor market. And when we look at networks, then we need to really understand networks in terms of strong ties and weak ties, as sociologist Mark Granovetter said in the 1970s. A lot of times when we look at networks, we look at strong ties, right? We think about people who are close to you, who are your friends, who are your family, and so on. And these are people who traverse the same networks as you, and you spend a lot of time seeing each other. And these are actually networks that are not exactly helpful for your job search. And a lot of times, in fact, what you would want to use is what we call weak ties, right? Because weak ties are people you don't see too much, you only see them on occasion. And these are the people who you should reach out for to do informational interviews, to learn about new opportunities around you, to maybe uncover the hidden job market. And that's why I highly recommend you to check out my playlist here on informational interviews, which I'll put in cards above. So through building stronger social capital, you will uncover new opportunities to enter the workforce. However, upon entering the workforce, obstacles still remained for immigrants to blend into the workplace culture. And the difficulties, whether it's perceived or real, in terms of operating the firm's working culture, at the end of the day, is about building social trust. And you're going to find this as the main theme that ties everything together in this video. Essentially, trust is the core issue that we're trying to deal with here, that we're trying to boost as much trust as possible, because low social trust between the dominant group and the ethnic minority group members is actually one of the biggest hurdles that immigrants will face in the workplace. Now, my second point on breaking the glass ceiling is to build cultural capital. And cultural capital is knowing what are the common symbols that boost solidarity. So for example, you know how to relate to that group of people. In Latin America, for example, it's very often for small talk to happen before getting to the core issue. You don't jump straight into the core issue. In America or in Canada, people tend to get straight to the point. And sometimes people call this high context cultures, which is cultures that they emphasize reading between the lines. Hey, what is the subtext here? What is the sub meaning here? Versus what we call low context cultures, which is essentially what you say is what you mean, and you don't have to read between the lines. And a lot of times when you look at more traditional cultures, cultures that have been established for a long time, such as India or China, Korea, Japan. And I list these because I'm more familiar with them, but all of these tend to be high context cultures where there's kind of like an undertone and underpinning between everything you say. Your words don't actually mean exactly what those words mean sometimes. And so for an immigrant to move to the West, one of the things they need to learn is the cultural capital. How do people communicate? How do people relate there? And this is what we call homophily, which is essentially people preferring others who are similar to themselves. And so when we look at trust and closeness in the workplace, people want to trust others. And if you are in a majority group and a new immigrant comes to your workplace, you would probably trust people who are more similar to yourself, right? So if you got to reverse engineer the whole process. So if you're an immigrant, you should try to acquire social capital to relate to the larger majority group. And it's essentially the social ability to converse on shared commonalities. And so for example, in Canada, one of the things that a lot of the majority group love to do is to talk about hockey or, about their kids' sports. But statistically speaking, it's very interesting that immigrants actually tend to watch basketball more than hockey, because a lot of the countries that they come from, they don't have a hockey legacy. They don't have hockey gear and hockey stories to pass on to their kids. And so in a Caucasian workplace where a whole bunch of Canadians are talking about their shared experiences or the Toronto Maple Leafs, one of the problems that an immigrant would have is like, well, I don't have anything hockey related to talk about. My kids aren't playing hockey. In fact, if anything, I'm watching basketball, right? And so these are gaps that immigrants have to be mindful about. And essentially, it may lead to the lack of connection between people, right? And like I said, trust is the bottom line here. You want to increase trust. You want to signal more of an insider. Do you agree that immigrants should improve their cache of cultural capital? Let me know in the comments below. Now, my third point is to build the right soft skills. Now, soft skills are often defined as self-management or interpersonal skills, and I talk a lot about soft skills in my playlist here, so check it out if you are interested in learning more about what soft skills are. And essentially, when an immigrant comes to the West, they will have different definitions of what we call desirable soft skills. Now, for example, body language would be one major difference. So there's something called the Duchenne smile, right? In the West, a researcher with the surname of Duchenne talked about the smile where, there's this smile, and there's a smile where your eyes are also kind of like crinkly as well, right? And it's perceived in the West that that is actually the sincere smile. So I'm going to try to do the Duchenne smile, but I'm not very good at it, but here it is, right? That's kind of like a Duchenne smile. Now in East Asia though, the Duchenne smile actually isn't really a thing. However, in East Asia, some people are taught to smile like this, or not even smile at all on pictures, right? And this leads to kind of like a culture gap. In the West, the Duchenne smile is perceived as warm and honest. However, in parts of Asia, it's perceived as being dumb and stupid. So in India, for example, research has shown that if you do a Duchenne smile in India, you are actually seen as being dumber and stupider than someone who does like more of a reserved, introverted smile, or maybe not smile at all. Within countries that are considered unstable, the Duchenne smile may even be perceived as being suspicious. And if you want to learn more about suspicious personalities, then check out my imposter video, which I'll put above. But essentially, the point is that while the Duchenne smile is claimed to be in the West as a universal quality that everyone should have, it's actually not the case. It's not universal. There's a lot of places that do not use the Duchenne smile. Other soft skills would be things that are typically unspoken of in the workplace, because the majority group will not tell this to you because it's considered racist or stereotyping or so on. But language barriers is obviously an issue, right? Anyone who speaks with an accent gets naturally deemed as an outsider, and you don't want to have too strong of an accent. You want to minimize that. You want your accent to blend in. And among the unspoken of things, there's also the presentation of self, such as the clothing, or how oily your hair is, or your smell. And if you're on the MTR, the subway in Hong Kong, and people are like, holding onto the arm bar, like the bars and stuff, you will smell some stuff, all right? So once again, you come to the West, it's a different standard. There's also other things such as the food you bring in the office. So if you're Asian, can you imagine bringing a durian or the 1,000-year fermented egg into your office, right? A lot of times people see it or they smell it, it's gonna be like, whoa, that's way too bizarre, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't be proud of your culture or you shouldn't eat this food, but there may be a consequence that needs to be paid if that happens, right? Also, how you carry yourself. There are eye contact norms in the West. So in the West, people expect, this type of eye contact all the time. You do that in Asia, that may be considered rude, especially, you're conditioned as a kid growing up. If the teacher is lecturing you, you do not look at your teacher. You keep your head down and you're like, you listen, right? However, if you're raised in the West, if a teacher is talking to you, you are actually expected to look at them eye to eye and really just face it, right? And so these are things that may unintentionally come up, or maybe you're not aware of if you are an immigrant to the West. So these are all norms that are kind of like pre-programmed scripts in our mind on stereotypes and biases and what is normal behavior. And when we're talking about culture, very rarely is there a right or wrong answer to anything, really. However, these scripts are essentially how we programmed our implicit biases on our day-to-day lives. And I talk a lot about implicit bias in my video here, which I'll put in the cards above. So definitely check it out if you're not sure what that is. Also, when we're talking about soft skills, different cultures have different modes of leadership. So for example, in China, they actually promote introversion in childhood, right? The introvert is actually considered the best student, the highest achiever. However, the education system in the West typically promotes extroversion, which is your communication skills, participating in group conversations and talking a lot and contributing, whether your contribution is actually good or not, right? Even when you look at the leaders in these cultures, Xi Jinping, who is actually the president of China, he comes across as cold, composed, and oftentimes even expressionless. However, when you look at the West, whether you support Trump or Obama, both of them are perceived as leaders because they're extroverted and they're emotional in their presentation of themselves, right? So when we're talking about soft skills, the higher you go, the more trust you need to command. And the best way to build trust is soft skills. So to summarize, in order to smash that glass ceiling, you really need to build trust. Yes, racism, stereotypes, language discrimination, and so on does exist, but those are things that are outside of your control, and you'll be much better off focusing on things that are within your control. In addition, research on implicit bias in diverse settings does show that implicit bias doesn't necessarily get in your way for your career to advance, as I dive into this in much more detail in my video that I talked about previously, right? However, while there are immigrant exceptions for those who are able to reach the top, surveys have shown that those who do reach the top are perceived to be super overachievers in terms of their performance, but not because of their soft skills. They are certainly the exception and not the norm. So, do you want to hedge your bet on being the exception or the norm, right? And that's why you really need to build those soft skills, build that social capital, and also build that cultural capital. And note, this is not about discrimination and so on. These are universal mechanisms. It doesn't only happen in the West, it actually happens everywhere in the world. So when you do a cross-national analysis on a different country's labor force, it applies. If you're a white man going to China to work, you too are going to face similar barriers in your climb to the corporate ladder. You too have to build the cultural cash and the soft skills. So to summarize, efforts have traditionally been done in language to help workers get on their feet through the door, but very little has been done on career advancement. And the situation actually gets even more precarious since a lot of jobs are now moving towards being more temporary or contract based. Now, if you're an immigrant and you're trying to figure out your way in working in the West, one of the things that would help a lot is to get a deeper understanding of your personality and how it fits in a cultural context. So I would highly recommend you to check out my free personality test, which I'll put in the links below, which is free, quick, and accurate. And it talks about how your personality fits in terms of the career characteristics that are the best fit for you. And make sure to join my Facebook group, Career Change Advice, to be in a community of people who are interested in making their careers work for them rather than the other way around. Now in this video, I basically taught you how to break the immigrant glass ceiling. In my next video, I'm going to focus specifically on the bamboo ceiling that Asians face in the West. So make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell for updates for when it comes out if that's what interests you. Also, leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to give this video a like and share it with your network if you found this to be valuable.